No matter who you are or where you go, heading outside is always worth it. Welcome to Humans Outside, where we're using the Humans Outside 365 Challenge to build a life around spending time in nature while learning from fascinating outdoor-minded guests. I'm Amy Bouchatz. I've let curiosity be my guide as a journalist for 18 years. But life, including my husband's war injuries, had burnt us out. So we moved sight unseen to Alaska to see if a change of scenery and new focus on outdoors was just the shift we needed. Since September 2017, I've spent at least 20 consecutive minutes outside every single day, no matter what, to explore how nature can change my life. Ready to hear from experts and outdoor lovers who make heading into nature just a part of who they are while we work to do the same? Let's go! The shutdowns of COVID helped fuel a major shift in how people thought about where they choose to call home. Thanks to office closures, many people realized that they really can live wherever they want, especially if their newly remote work has a shot at staying that way. As a remote worker for over a decade, it's a freedom that helped fuel our sight unseen move to Alaska in 2016. We picked moving here because we wanted easy access to big nature. We were at a spot where a big change was coming, whether we wanted it or not, thanks to my husband getting out of the military. And Alaska is the place we picked to call home. Access to nature, and by extension, whole life health, was our top priority in picking location. Now, there are plenty of places that can make you happy and plenty of reasons you might be happy there. So if you can live anywhere and you're wanting to make the change, how the heck do you choose where to go? That is the subject of Melody Warnick's new book, If You Could Live Anywhere, The Surprising Importance of Place in a Work from Anywhere World. I'm honored to share our story of moving to Alaska included in her book, and Melody has been on this podcast before. Her first book, This Is Where You Belong, Finding Home Wherever You Are, helped me learn how to love where I live after we moved here. Today she's here with us again to discuss the role of place in making life great, the steps to decide where you want to live, and how to factor in things that make you happy, like spending time outside. And as an aside, this is our second time recording this conversation. Our first go, I forgot to press record. Guess what? It does happen. Melody, welcome to Humans Outside.
Thank you so much for having me, Amy.
Well, thank you so much for being here. I'm going to full disclosure here. And this is our second time doing this interview because I'm a dummy and did not record it the first time. So thank you for your time several weeks ago and today doing this interview with me. This is the dedication you have for the Humans Outside audience, and I feel like they need to know that.
Well, I am here for you, and I would like to say that this interview is just going to be so much better than the first interview that got lost. That is probably not totally true, but we will tell ourselves.
We will tell ourselves, and I don't even remember it that well. So
we are having a new conversation today with just new topics, new energy. We're bringing it.
Yeah, we definitely are. So thank you for double your time very, very much.
Absolutely.
So we always imagine ourselves in our guest's favorite outdoor space, hanging out, having a conversation there with them, as if we were there with you out somewhere outside that you love. So were that the case, where are we with you today?
So today, I think we're going to be on my back porch. It is perfect weather in Blacksburg, Virginia today. We've had, the world's most humid summer, and finally September has hit, and it's in the 70s and it feels kind of crisp, like you can feel fall in the air. And I ate my lunch out there and just had the sunshine on my back, just warming me up. And, was watching the blue jays fly. And so we're in a neighborhood. This is not in nature per se, but it is my little patch of nature that makes me happy. So that is where I will be.
Anywhere outside your door counts as nature. And
Yes.
Also, I would like to add, I don't think that that's where we pretended to talk last time. So I
couldn't remember where we pretended to talk. So yes, it's new information.
It's new information. And you are on basically a book tour right now promoting your new book. So I know you're having lots of conversations about picking where to live and place-based decisions and that kind of thing. And I'm really grateful that for you including me in your book. It's pretty spectacular, especially since your first book was so instrumental in how I viewed where we moved.
Well, I appreciate you saying that. And your story is one that I keep talking about when I go on other people's podcasts because I think it's just such a good example of what people are doing these days. You know, we have so many more people who all of a sudden, during COVID in particular, found themselves location independent. And people are becoming really thoughtful and intentional about where they want to live. And what that means for a lot of people is, what do I want my life to look like? You know, not just what house do I want to live in, but how do I want my new community, my new city, my new place to change my life? And so your story, I feel, really exemplifies the way people are thinking about this issue, that you chose Alaska because you wanted to live a life that was more in touch with nature. And I think a lot of people are looking for things like that. They're looking for a life that feels a little more grounded, a little slower maybe. They want to move to places that just make them happier and more purposeful. And that's something I try to do in my book, is help people think about the things they want in their life and the values they want to sort of exemplify in their place.
Yeah. So maybe start by giving us a little bit of a rundown. What inspired you to help people pick where they live? Was this totally COVID driven? Like, what was the inspiration?
So it was something I'd been thinking about before COVID, believe it or not. So I wrote my book, This Is Where You Belong. It came out in 2016, and it was really about my personal journey to move to a new town and put down roots here. This place I'd never lived before and didn't really like it first. And so I kind of dove into the research around how people put down those roots and start to feel at home in a new place. And then I started speaking in communities that were interested in this. I started just obsessing over place, could not let it go. And I started noticing this pattern even before COVID of two things happening. First, that I was seeing people move to communities not because they were moved there by an employer, but because they simply chose it for themselves. I knew lots of people in my adopted town of Blacksburg who could have gone anywhere. Their jobs were online or they were retired or something like that, and they were choosing this town. So I became kind of curious about that trend of people being intentional about where they moved. But I also discovered this whole other thing going on, which was that towns are very interested in attracting you. That in the same way that there are all these people who are trying to make these choices and trying to pick where to live, there are legions of cities and communities out there that really want you to pick their town. That was driven home to me in 2018 when we saw Tulsa, Oklahoma start the Tulsa Remote program. And that was them offering a $5,000 cash bonus to location independent workers who moved to their community. And it went so well for Tulsa that lots of other communities started offering similar perks. Bentonville, Arkansas offers cash and a mountain bike if you move to their town. And so it was kind of these two things going on, people looking for the right place and places looking for the right people. And so I wanted to write a book that helped sort of both sides of those equations, that helped people think about and find their right place, but also kind of explored all the things that towns and cities are doing to make themselves more enticing for those people.
Yeah. What tactics do you find as part of your research that people use to pick their next home? What are like the common threads here?
Yeah. So when it comes right down to it, people are sort of struggling along through this. People don't always know what's important, either, in the grand scheme of things, or even what's important to them. But we see a couple things that tend to be factors for a lot of people. First is cost of living. I mean, now more than ever, with inflation massively on the rise and real estate prices going up, people are really looking hard for a place that will give them a lower cost of living. And totally understandably, because if you can change your cost of living, it really is like giving yourself a raise. So people are looking for that. But I think beyond that, people really are looking for quality of life factors. And that is like the most sort of vague phrase that can describe all sorts of things. But I tend to think of it as what makes you happy in your life on a daily basis. So for a lot of people, that can be something like my town has walking paths, or I have access to restaurants or a good coffee shop or bars or entertainment. And I think nature is huge in there. We see a lot of people who are, especially during COVID, this was kind of an exodus of people leaving cities and relocating to places where they would have more access to nature and to the outdoors. So even though that's kind of lumped in with quality of life, I think it's huge for a lot of people. So people kind of have these ideas about what matters to them, but what they do with that information really varies. I've encountered people who literally blindly put their finger on a map or a globe and just say, let's go there. There's a lot of people.
That seems very risky.
Oh yeah, that is definitely not recommended. I think those are people who are just like super adventurous spirits and willing to just try anything. But
did you ever do that when you were a kid? Like spin the globe and like, I'm going to go live here. Put your finger on and then you're like, oh crap, it's Antarctica again.
Dang it, it's Detroit.
Right.
Yeah. Well, totally. I mean, there is something appealing about that, right? That's one of the trends in place and place choosing that I talk about in the book as well, is the rise of nomads, people who have decided, I don't want to be in any place for any extended period of time. I just want to explore the world. And so if you're a nomad and you're only staying someplace a month or two, or maybe even less sometimes, then sure, spin that globe and put your finger down and go wherever. For the majority of us who are actually looking for a place where we can settle, buy a house, become part of a community, that's not really recommended. And yet, a lot of us are kind of floundering here. I talked in the book to one woman who had lived in Texas for a long time, was not a huge fan, and she and her boyfriend were on a road trip across Iowa and drove through this really adorable small town and saw an old house for sale. It was really affordable, and they just decided, let's move here. And it took them a little bit to realize it wasn't a great fit for them. And that's when they really decided to drill down on what would be a good fit for us. What are the things in our community that make us feel most at home? And for them, it was, maybe equally random things. I think it was stuff like, we want to have access to a yarn shop because she was really big into knitting, and her husband didn't want to be any place that had tornadoes because he'd had a bad experience when he was younger. So they ended up narrowing in on Eugene, Oregon as their ideal community. And this time they went and did like a sampler trip, tried it out for a week and really fell in love and felt like it was a good decision for them. But random isn't always great. These are huge decisions, and kind of being whimsical about it can be hard.
What I hear you saying is you come to a point where you are willing to understand what's important to you and then willing to move against that. Because, okay, while you were talking about the nomad thing, I'm thinking, that sounds great, but I got these kids, man. Okay, but people do that with kids. The difference between those folks and me is that they have decided that being a nomad is important enough to them that they're going to surmount whatever obstacles are there. So that for, I'm thinking like have school, right? So they're willing to homeschool or whatever, their kids to make that lifestyle work for them. Just like when I said I want to move to Alaska, it wasn't oh, look at all these obstacles, guess we're not going. It was, look at all these obstacles, now let's plan for how to get over them. And yes, there are matters of immense privilege with both of those examples, that we financially can do that, or that we have the ability to make a plan to financially do that, right? And so I definitely want to acknowledge that. But at the same time, a big piece of that puzzle is just having enough desire for it to find a way to do it.
100%. One of the things about digital nomads, it is like the number one aspirational spectator sport. You know, if you survey Americans about, are you going to become a nomad in the next 10 years? Like an enormous percentage are like, yes, I am doing that. And, you know, enough for people to predict that within the next 10 years, we'll have like 1 billion nomads in the world. And the reality is probably way more people thinking it sounds awesome, but not willing to, like you said, overcome all the obstacles that most people would face to take up that kind of life. But I think your story is a great example that even when you're really thoughtful about what kind of place you want to end up and what you think it will do for your life, none of that is easy. You know, moving is arduous. It is a lot of work. It's a lot of money. It's physically demanding. It's emotionally demanding. So I like to remind people, even those who have found themselves in that location independent space, you don't have to move. You know, you are not obligated to relocate just because you can. But if you do decide to relocate, don't expect that even this really thoughtful, intentional move is going to be easy. Your story of, you know, that I share in the book of moving to Alaska because you think it will open your family up to all this time in the outdoors, and then kind of landing there and being like, oh, the weather's crappy and there's mosquitoes, and, you know, we have this brief window of summer, and you could have interpreted that as, and maybe you did, you could have interpreted that as, we have made a terrible mistake with our lives. Like, what have we done? But instead, you decided, if I'm going to get out of this place what I wanted to get out of it, I'm going to have to work for it. And we're going to buy the gear, and we're going to make goals to be outside every day. So I think we want our places to change our lives and to make us different people. That almost never happens just automatically. We always have to contribute something to our own evolution inside a community.
Yeah. Two things about that. One, well, I don't think moving here was a mistake. Let's be clear. I even
Maybe
in
you
that,
had moments.
No, even in that journey, I knew this was the right place for us, and this is where I wanted to be, and that the next step was overcoming my own attitude. I'm going to use the word deficiencies, although you could also view those as completely reasonable responses. But I knew that those things were things that I needed to internally overcome. But the other side of that is this idea of yes, sometimes a move may be the right thing. And it was the right thing for us. Like, we were going to move whether we moved here or not. We were going to move somewhere, because where we were was not somewhere we wanted to stay. And that had nothing to do with access to the outdoors. It had to do with Army and all this other stuff we were dealing with. So there's that. But the independent of that factor, if you are moving somewhere to become a different person, newsflash, you move with yourself.
Yeah.
And so, unfortunately, you might accidentally pack your problems and bring them with you. And that's pretty much what I found, that we had moved here for this concept. And yes, we had found a new place to live, and we needed to do that. So check, box checked. But I still had me and the way I thought about things that had moved with me, and I needed to overcome that. And so if we had not actually needed to move or wanted to move somewhere, if we could have stayed there reasonably, had I had that perception at that time, could have stepped back and said, okay, how can I make me work here instead of here work for me? and change how I looked at the world in much the same way that I have done now here, where I said, okay, like, what can I do? And that's really where your first book helped me, right? Was to say, okay, how can I change how I'm perceiving where I live and receiving where I live to make it be something that can work for me?
Right. And it is kind of a little bit of something I wrestled with between the two books, because in the first book, This Is Where You Belong, I talk about this idea of the geographic cure, which is this idea that a lot of us have that we're just going to find the new place and it is going to heal us. It is going to make our lives better. And some of that is just this idea of a fresh slate. That whatever place we're leaving, we're going to leave behind all the complications of life that have started to weigh us down, relationships that are a little more complex than we want, or obligations. And we just got to shed that and move someplace new. And that is really enticing a lot of the time. We're just going to burn it all down and start over. But the thing that I realized as I moved to Blacksburg and kind of worked to put down roots here is just what you said. You're bringing yourself with you, and you don't necessarily find the perfect place that's going to heal you. You make your place right by choosing it and by deciding that this is going to be the right place for you. But the reality is, things about our lives do change when we move. And so that was kind of one of the things that I started thinking about as I was writing If You Could Live Anywhere. Not everything changes. We don't necessarily change, but a new place can do something for us. It might change our finances a little by, we move to a lower cost of living area, and all of a sudden we free up a little more money to invest in things we care about. I think also a well-chosen place sort of acts as a daily reminder to you about what you value and what you hope to create of your life. Yeah. I share in the book the story of a couple from Seattle who moved away from the city because their number one goal really was raising chickens. They envisioned themselves having this kind of rural life where they could have chickens and dogs and, canned peaches and stuff like that. And they weren't able to do that in Seattle. And that was really guiding their search. They ended up in Tennessee and they're happy there. But they could have ended up in Tennessee and said, oh, chickens, weren't all we thought they were going to be. But for them, the move kind of created space in their life for these things that they already knew they wanted. It didn't change who they were fundamentally. Right. And they probably, had to face those remnants of their city selves that weren't used to doing stuff like this. But it gave them the opportunity to kind of to evolve into those people they hoped to be.
And there really are place considerations that are things that are outside of you, like the weather. So you can not love being in the heat and find that's where you live. And really, all things considered, the heat is what's keeping you from living your best life. Okay. Or I grew up on a beach. I love a beach. Okay. If I could find an affordable beach to move to, that was even here in Alaska, that was close to where we needed to live for access to the airport and that kind of thing, 100% would move there. Not even a hesitation, right? Because I love the beach. Or maybe you love mountains. Well, you can change you all day and all night, and a mountain is not going to spring up in your backyard. That's just not how mountains work, guys. Right. So those sort of place considerations certainly are valid and are definitely things that you're not going to change just by looking inward, if you will.
Right, for sure. And This Is Where You Belong, it's like, okay, you ended up in a place that doesn't have that stuff you like. Here's how to adjust to that. Here's how to learn to like what you have. But on the other hand, if you have the choice, if you're at the beginning of that process and can think about, what do I really want? What will make me happy? Then of course, choose the things that you love. There's tons of research that shows living near water makes people feel better, makes people more content. You're right. It is incredibly expensive in most places, but if that is a possibility for you and that's something that you want, you have to go toward that. You can't just wish it into existence and make yourself live near a beach just because you really wanted it.
Yeah. Which is, let me just say, a major bummer.
So, it's a huge bummer. Oh my gosh.
Hey, humans. If you want to build your own outdoor habit, the Humans Outside 365 Challenge is a great way to get started. You can even score some really cool and exclusive challenge swag, including a finisher decal and medal in the process. All you need to do is visit humansoutside.com/challenge. You'll also get an outdoor challenge guide written by me for you, an exclusive challenge tracker, and insider info all year long. You don't want to be left out of this. Go to humansoutside.com/challenge to learn more now. Okay, back to the show. So I think people toy with living wherever they want, okay? This is all good in theory, but it's hard to do it. So we've kind of already talked about how you have to actually want to, okay? So how do you make easing into this more palatable? Do you have an on-ramp to feeling better about jumping in here?
Well, so one of the things I talk about in the book is making a location strategy for yourself. And this is kind of this idea that companies like Starbucks are really data-driven when it comes to where they're going to put their new stores. You know, they have drilled down to how much traffic goes by this lot. And we don't have access to all that data, but what we do have access to is data about ourselves and our own experiences. And so I kind of lay out some instructions to help people think about this, starting with, first, do you really need to move? You know, some people like you're going to move, your situation is untenable where you are or whatever. But a lot of people who are asking themselves this question, should we move? We can live anywhere. Should we relocate? Might really be happy where they are. And so it's good to start by really digging into those questions. You know, what would we miss about our lives here? What are we hoping to change? And can we do it right where we live? So once you've gone through that, then I have a few more exercises in the book, and people can actually get a free download of these in a workbook form at my website, melodywarnick.com, if you subscribe to my newsletter. But I have exercises that kind of help you think through what is your ideal place and what kind of values are you really hoping to live out in your new community. I have this list where, I kind of walk people through what are some of the major things that people think about when they're making choices about where to move, from, population size to proximity of hospitals to climate change factors and things like that. So, I think that does help people ease into it because it gives you some confidence that you have researched this thoroughly, you have really thought about it, you've questioned yourself. And so if you've decided to move forward with a move and you've chosen a place, it's probably because you've put a lot of effort into this. Mm-hmm. I think the actual move, it is going to be hard. Don't fool yourself into thinking that, once I move, my life is going to be easier in so many ways. You have to kind of expect that there is an adjustment period. Mm-hmm. That can be up to 6 years for you to fully develop the kind of place attachment that means that you really love your place and feel at home in it. But then it kind of goes back to some of the tips I offer in This Is Where You Belong about, when you're new in a place, here are some ideas for really building community and developing relationships and stuff like that. So I think it is possible to make these moves and be happy with. I always, talk about how moving is such a mess and so chaotic and stuff like that. And people listening are probably like, yes, you are right. I will never do that. Thank you. But really, we do these things and it is okay. It will be okay. It is possible to move to some place that you really love and that can improve your life and make it better.
So you earlier you laid out, think about why it is you want to move and have a plan for picking that. And then like the things that are important to you essentially. And then what you just said is think about the strategies for picking that place, right? So you have like this concept and then you have actionable steps in making that happen.
Right. And between those two things is honestly like a fair bit of research, right?
Yeah.
You know that it's really important to you, for instance, to send your kids to well-ranked schools. And how do you find out which are the well-ranked schools? That can be tough. So, it's a process of looking at websites and hopping online and asking people. If you throw this out on Facebook, what's a small to mid-sized town that has great schools that I should consider moving to? You'll get like 8,000 answers. So
right.
There is an abundance of choice. There's thousands of towns all over the world. So unfortunately, there's not really a great shortcut there for just, there are websites like livability.com, Make My Move, catalogs, all those communities. They're offering bonuses for people who live there, whether that's move here and we'll give you $10,000 or we'll help you pay off your student loans, or you can have free land, stuff like that. So those are a few interesting starting points. I also like to tell people or remind people that most people tend to be happier if they're living near family or, for some people, friends. And so it is something to think about as kind of like an initial step. Where do family members live? Do we want to be close to them? Not everyone does,
Yeah, some people, it makes them happier to live far away from
Yeah,
family.
100%. I have never really lived close to family, and that's been okay. But I was coaching a woman recently who was trying to make this tough decision about where to move. And she was trying to decide between staying near her current home because her mom lived nearby and she was close to her mom, or moving out west. She was looking at cities in Colorado and Montana because she really loved the access to nature and she's really outdoorsy and loves hiking and rock climbing and things like that. And that was a super difficult choice for her, like to decide between closeness to family or closeness to amenities that make you happy. She still hasn't decided. She's still working on it. So these are tough choices for sure, but give yourself time and give yourself grace too. I think people are freaked out about the idea of making a mistake here because they can be expensive mistakes. They can be kind of time consuming mistakes, but wherever you live, even if you end up deciding this isn't the right place for us, we're not going to stay here long term, you're going to have experiences that help you grow, that help you become a different, hopefully better person, and nothing is wasted, I guess.
Yeah. The military community is fascinating for this. So for people who don't know, military personnel move every 2 to 3 years is pretty typical. You are, contracted to be a soldier or airman or whatever, and they tell you where to live, and that's where you go. And then 2 or 3 years later, they say it's time for you to go to a different duty station. We need your skill set in Guam or the literal middle of nowhere in Nebraska. Okay, like we need you. Only you can help us in Nebraska, and that's how it feels. And so they can move you for you. Like the move process itself is kind of a different disaster. Okay. And it's been very, very chaotic recently with truck driver shortages and all these things. That's a different subject. But then you get there and now you have to settle in and make the most of it for a couple of years. And if you're lucky, you love it. And then you're sad to move. And if you're unlucky, you just sort of muddle through or whatever. Lots of people get out of the military because they don't like that lifestyle. But then, let's say you make it for 20 years going hither and thither, and now you're getting out of the military, which is what we were doing, and you have to decide where do you want to go. And so there are these Facebook groups of military members they're retirement support groups, but the most often asked question is, where should we move? I want to live somewhere that has good access to restaurants and is outdoorsy and doesn't tax military retirement and has good access to hospitals. And we like water parks. So it needs to be, like just like very, very specific things, right? Because they have spent their entire lives, adult lives, not living where they want to live. And now they know exactly what they like and they want to pick places. And so help me God, there are more people who respond with like the perfect response. Well, the place that you're talking about is this random city in Idaho.
Oh my gosh, I love that.
And every single time I'm like, well, that doesn't exist. And sure enough, somebody's like, well, the place that you're talking about is in Wisconsin. Like,
well, and what a better group to ask, because they have moved around so much. Military families have probably seen a lot of the country and beyond. And yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah, it's really interesting to watch that. And it makes you remember that no matter what your priorities are, and oh, by the way, you can have more than one. You can really want to live in proximity to a national park and really like water slides and also need a good school. And also, oh, by the way, we are in the tech industry. Like all of those things can be true at the same time with even more random facts in there. And there is a place out there that fits those things. It's just a matter of finding it and getting there and making all of that happen. So you mentioned a few minutes ago that it's like people are afraid of making a mistake. And you mentioned before that it can take up to 6 years to figure out if a mistake has in fact been made. And I'm just sitting here thinking, my God, that is a really long time to live with what may turn out to have been a mistake. So how do you know if you're just in the I'm getting used to this period or if you're in the mistake period? And like what happens if you do make a mistake? Like what's your advice for people who are like, we don't actually like Iowa, what we really need is Oregon, which are very different places? So
yeah, well, and that's a great question, because you don't always know, right? If you expect that this is a process, it's going to take you a little bit to settle into a place, you're not sure where that line is between I'm still settling in, I'm still getting to know people, and oh my gosh, this was not right for us and we need to cut our losses and move on. So, and I don't know that there is a perfect
I need like a recipe.
I know, like I wish, but like for me, I had the same reaction to that 6-year figure. And that's why I wrote This Is Where You Belong, which the whole concept was, I don't want it to take 6 years like that. I don't want to be miserable for 6 years. And so I did these Love Where You Live experiments that were all about, I'm going to do the kinds of things that I see place attached people who love their community doing, and that is going to accelerate the process for me. So it was like, I'm going to go to all the community events and I'm going to take banana bread around to my neighbors, and I'm going to really embed myself in nature here. I'm going to spend a lot of time hiking and stuff. And so I was a very active participant in trying to change my feelings about my place. And I've seen other people do that same thing too. You are a perfect example of this. Like, I am not loving it here, or this isn't totally what I expected, but I'm going to invest in getting outside. I'm going to join these groups and make friends and stuff like that. So I think most people probably, you go through a period after moving where you're just trying to get your head on straight. You don't have any bandwidth for anything new. But, maybe a couple months in, you're like, okay, I'm going to join the book club at the library, or I'm going to start trying out all the new restaurants in town, or whatever. And you become a very active participant in making yourself happy here, not expecting it to just happen for you and wash over you with all this delight, but, you're going to be part of it. I have talked to people who say, I've done those things and I've been here for 8 years and it still isn't really working for me. And I say, that's okay. Like, every community has a personality just like people do. And we're looking for a good person environment fit. And there's a lot of wiggle room there that sometimes we can adjust ourselves, or the environment adjusts to us to make us happier where we've chosen. But sometimes it just was a bad fit. Or sometimes you've changed, your life has changed, and the place that was fine for you 5 or 6 years ago isn't working anymore. And I think it's okay to not feel like a failure when that happens and just say, I did my best and it's time to move on. Like your story about military families, like, gosh, who is more of an expert on moving and quickly settling into a community than a military family? And I've talked to a lot of military families, military spouses especially, who maybe even have less autonomy in this process. And my friend Jen told me something that I included in This Is Where You Belong, which was a piece of advice she was given by her military mother-in-law, who just said, wherever you go, unpack your suitcase, metaphorically, emotionally decide, I want to love it here and I'm going to do everything I can to make this my home. And I saw her do that again and again in communities all over, just really engage enough that when it came time to move, she was a little sad about it every time.
Yeah. I think at the end of the day, though, there's nothing wrong with saying, like, we tried this and it wasn't for me. Yeah. And that is just a part of life. It's a pretty big risk. I mean, that is a risk, but it is a part of every risk that you take. And so even when we talk about heading outside and trying something new, it's with this idea, like, you don't have to love everything you do outside. You don't even have to try. I always tell my kids, you don't have to like your food. You just have to try it. Well, guess what? You're a grown up. You don't have to do that either. Like, you don't have to try everything in the world, but you have to be honest with yourself about how your experiences are and what is flavoring that experience. And so when I go out and try a new activity that I don't love, right, I say, like, what about this did I not like? And is that because the weather was bad while I was doing it? Is it the activity or the situation, and so on and so forth? And maybe give it another shot or not. That's fine too. And so when you move somewhere to achieve something, so let's say you're moving somewhere because you want to spend some more time outside, and you get there and the weather's bad, like in my situation, right? Like, so I'm looking at it like, is it because I moved somewhere where the weather's bad and that's like my bad? I should have known better than that. And now I should move somewhere where the weather is not bad? Or is that because I have an unreasonable expectation for how weather is going to obey my every whim? And unfortunately, it turns out that it's the last one. So I changed me, right?
Yes.
But that's how it goes. And I think that's part of being human, and I think that's completely fine.
Yeah, totally. I mean, there is a lot of margin for error here. There's margin for error in kind of misidentifying what this community you've chosen maybe has to offer or what it's really like. And there's errors that we can make about ourselves and who we are and what we actually want in our lives. So I think when you move, you get to change your perspective about both of those things. Like, you kind of shift your expectations about what you thought this place would be like and what it actually is like. And you can shift your perspective about what you're capable of too and who you are. And, I think there's a lot of work we can do to make a place right for ourselves once we've chosen it. But I also totally agree that it's okay to say, this was a mistake and we're going to move someplace else. There's risk every time we make these sort of big decisions, but that's kind of an exciting thing too. I talked to someone for the book who was living in Florida during the Great Recession. She and her husband both lost their jobs and were just really struggling financially. And the way they decided to solve that problem was they moved to Panama. And talk about a move that has a lot of potential for true culture shock and maybe some, oh my gosh, what have we done sort of moments. But here's this couple in their 50s and they found that they really loved it. It was totally different, probably not exactly what they thought they were getting into, but They lived there for a few years. They saved tons of money. They reduced their stress. They started a new business and ultimately didn't stay forever. They moved back to Florida because aging parents needed them. And that was okay too. She still kind of talks about, I hope that in the future we can live abroad again, but they got to have this really enriching, exciting experience. And maybe we should all think about our time in places a little more like that. That, no matter how it turns out in the end, it can be a growth period for you for sure.
Well, Melody, thank you so much for coming on Humans Outside today, for doing this discussion twice. I think this one was better.
I think this one was totally different. I don't remember hitting on any of this before. Yeah. And yes, I agree. It was so much better.
Well, people can find your book wherever they find books, wherever in their library, at your local bookstore, or online, wherever that may be. And I wish you the best of luck with it.
Thank you so much, Amy. It was a pleasure talking to you.
Thanks so much for listening to this week's episode of Humans Outside. If you've enjoyed this episode, take a second to leave a rating and review wherever you get your podcasts. That makes it easier for others to find the podcast too. Your positive review makes a huge difference. Now, go get outside. Until next time, we'll see you out there.